Last week, we covered the first 8.5 chapters of the book of Numbers, and we did it all at once. And the sermon last week was called Organizational Management 101. And I summed up this first section of Numbers, these chapters, saying that God is administrating and organizing his people for the purpose of getting them from Mount Sinai to the land of Canaan. And as I said last week, I don't know how you do that with that many people. It's crazy. But there's an interesting detail in last week's passage that I mentioned, but I didn't spend a lot of time with. This week it needs to be emphasized, I think, if we're going to hear what's happening in our passage. After each of the administrative instructions, or really commands through those first 8.5 chapters, the text gives us some sort of summary statement. So God instructs the people, line up in this way. Order yourselves around the tabernacle in this way. Each of you clans of the Levites, do this with the tabernacle. And then after each of those sets of instructions, what we hear is something summarizing what happens. Something like this. Thus did Moses and Aaron and all of the congregation of the people of Israel. According to all that the Lord had commanded Moses, the people did. And we hear that or some variation of it over and over again. Right? And so more than just a summary of what has happened, this is actually an evaluation summary. It says, this is what happened, and it is good. The reason this is so shocking for us in many ways as we read through the book of Numbers, these early chapters, is that we know the whole story for the most part. We've read ahead in Numbers. We know a little bit about what happens to the Israelites. But if we're honest with the story, as it unfolds so far, this obedience actually shouldn't surprise us that much. Think about where we've come from this year. The Israelites' journey, starting with their first trip through the wilderness, which was a bit rocky, but they were learning to trust God, and they weren't really sure what they had gotten themselves into, and they weren't totally sure that this God was trustworthy. And so in that first wilderness time, as they grumble, it's because they lack basic necessities and are legitimately nervous about where these are going to come from, and God has yet to demonstrate his trustworthiness in these matters. But then they arrive at Mount Sinai, where they're still a bit reluctant. They're not quite sure, okay, this God has provided for us in the wilderness, but is he safe to approach, even if he's told us to do so? And so instead of coming near to him, they ask for a mediator. And then as the story goes, there are 3 incidents between when Israel makes a covenant with God in the middle of Exodus and chapter 9 of the book of Numbers. And so the last half of Exodus, all of Leviticus, the first part of Numbers, there are 3 incidents that we should take note of. The first is that they betray God, making and worshiping a golden calf. Then 2 priests, Nadab and Abihu, are consumed by fire when they worship God in an inappropriate way. And then there's a sort of random guy who is stoned for blaspheming the name of God and cursing at the end of Leviticus. And that's it. Considering this, the last chapters of Exodus are filled with the same kind of eager obedience that we find in these early chapters of Numbers. The Israelites give so much gold and linen and bronze and materials for the tabernacle that Moses actually has to say, stop giving. No more. We can't take any more. We don't need any more. And then they construct the tabernacle exactly as God has instructed. And then in Leviticus, they follow with expert precision the meticulous instructions for dedicating the temple and dedicating the priests and all of the furniture involved. And then They obey God when he commands them to actually stone that blasphemer to death. And 8 chapters into the book of Numbers, this pattern continues. The Lord commands, and the people do all that the Lord commands. One of the hardest things about reading the Bible is that we often read it with the end in mind. And sometimes it's helpful to just suspend what we know just long enough to hear a passage sort of on its own terms. And here's what we know about the passage we're going to look at this morning. The Israelites have been at the mountain approximately a year. And this year, especially since receiving instructions for the tabernacle, the Israelites' time is overwhelmingly identified with obedience and faithfulness. The acts of disobedience and rebellion at this point in the story are seen not as the norm for them, but as exceptions to the rule. God's law, his commandments, his covenant, and his presence seem to be doing their job thus far. The Israelites have the appearance of faithfulness. Think about this journey as the SATs. Ask anyone how to take the SATs and they'll tell you take the PSATs first. Or you can take the SATs expecting to take them a second time. But the goal, right, is that when you take it the official time, you know exactly what, before you take it the official time, in your studying, you've known exactly what to study for, so that when you take the real test, you're ready, having studied the very most important parts. For the Israelites, the wilderness between Egypt and Mount Sinai was their pre-test, if you will. God has been busy teaching and instructing them ever since as they have camped around this mountain. And they are ready to take the test. God has prepared them to leave. And with every administrative detail, they fall into place. They fall into line. They know exactly how to move forward. And so like a group of undisciplined punk teenagers that have now become good soldiers at the end of boot camp, walking in lockstep together as a unit, so we see the Israelites come together, fall into line, find their place, and look to the one who will direct them. So the book of Numbers is a bit tricky because its chronology jumps around a little bit. And our passage just demonstrates that because it starts with a summary, and this summary starts on the day that the tabernacle was set up, which happened at the end of Exodus. But by the end of our summary, it reaches up to the future or the present of some sort. So, yeah, you follow. You tell me what is the chronology. No, if you'll turn to chapter 9, verse 15, we'll start reading. Numbers chapter 9, verse 15. On the day that the tabernacle was set up, right, back at Exodus, the cloud covered the tabernacle, the tent of the testimony, and at evening it was over the tabernacle like the appearance of fire until morning. So it was always. The cloud covered it by day, and the appearance of fire by night. And whenever the cloud lifted from over the tent, after that the people of Israel set out. And in the place where the cloud settled down, there the people of Israel camped. At the command of the Lord, the people of Israel set out, and at the command of the Lord they camped. As long as the cloud rested over the tabernacle, they remained in the camp. Even when the cloud continued over the tabernacle many days, the people of Israel kept the charge of the Lord and did not set out. Sometimes the cloud was a few days over the tabernacle, and according to the command of the Lord, they remained in camp. Then, according to the command of the Lord, they set out. And sometimes the cloud remained from evening until morning. And when the cloud lifted in the morning, they set out. Or if it continued for a day and a night, when the cloud lifted, they set out. whether it was 2 days or a month or a longer time, that the cloud continued over the tabernacle, abiding there. The people of Israel remained in the camp and did not set out. But when it lifted, they set out. At the command of the Lord, they camped. And at the command of the Lord, they set out. They kept charge of the Lord, and at the command of the Lord by Moses. Right? This is not subtle. In case we missed it in all of the early chapters of Numbers, this summary description intends to bludgeon us, to wake up, and to pay attention. So it was always, whenever, at the command of the Lord, as long as, even when, the people kept the charge of the Lord. At the command of the Lord they camped. At the command of the Lord they set out. Right? You hear that. There are no buts. There are no howevers. There are no qualifications. God has ordained a clear signal by which his people will follow him. And we read that they do just that. When God moves, so do his people. You kind of get the impression that if there was a spy from the land of Canaan or coming back from Egypt, checking these people out, trying to figure out just who these guys are and what they're up to, seeing what kind of threat they might be moving through the wilderness in a huge, large mass, you would see from a distance a very specific pattern. You'd see this cloud rise and move and fall, and you'd see this mass of people rise and move and follow over and over again. From a distance, Israel has the appearance of following their God. The appearance of following God is easy to maintain, especially at the mountain. But the wilderness is dangerous terrain. It's uncomfortable and it's uncertain. There are constant threats to your security in the wilderness. And it is in the wilderness that faith is tested. And that following God requires more than a law is capable of providing. See, a law can provide a structure and an order for people as they move through the wilderness toward God's people, towards God's promises. But a law cannot force people to trust that God will fulfill his promises and take them to the land that he promised them. A law can create the possibility and the space for people to draw near to him or to God. But a law can't make people want to draw near to him. A law can reveal God's heart, and it can be a safeguard against wicked hearts. But a law cannot change hearts. And a law can instruct people how to gather their daily bread, the bread that God provides for them. But a law cannot make the people be content with his daily provision. One can be faithful in obeying and following a law, creating the appearance of following God. And yet, the limits of a law are seen as that person begins to make backup plans, as that person grumbles, cries, doubts, misunderstands, and ultimately rebels. This is what follows in Numbers. The orderly arrangement of God's people and their eagerness to step into line is followed by these very kinds of responses to God. Through 9 chapters of Numbers, Israel has had the appearance of a sort of well-oiled machine. But we're about to find out that that machine has parts that are faulty. There is a fatal flaw within it. Since we covered most of what's in chapters 11 and 12, when we read the parallel accounts in Exodus, what I want to do here is just highlight a couple of these accounts, these events here, provide some summaries and some explanation for some of what will follow. But there are 6 things that happen when Israel sets out from the mountain and they begin to travel. 6 sort of events or moments, I think, that are noteworthy. The first one is that Moses asks an in-law to help guide the Israelites through the wilderness. Second, the people complain. Third, the people cry because they are unsatisfied with the food that God has given them and they want different food. Fourth, Moses complains about the people and he questions God's ability to meet their demands. Fifth, when God's Spirit rests on 2 guys who it wasn't supposed to rest on, and they prophesy and they weren't really supposed to prophesy, Joshua gets upset and he goes to Moses and tells Moses, stop them. And then 6th, Aaron and Miriam, Moses' own blood, come against him. They speak against him. You might recognize when we went through Exodus, we looked at each of these accounts as they parallel the accounts in the first wilderness journey. As we read these chapters, it should be noticed that whatever the problem is for Israel, it's all through Israel, right? It extends from Moses and it reaches out to the very edges of the camp. These quick stories effectively put everyone on the hook. The great and mighty Moses and the unnamed outliers at the borders of the camp. The rabble, or riffraff, depending on your translation. And literally all of the people are held accountable. We even get Moses' inner circle, Joshua and Aaron and Miriam, identified as bearing the same guilt. And so it's made clear, this is not just a couple of priests, as in the Nadab and Abihu story. This isn't just a couple troublemakers like the random guy who's blaspheming God's name. And it isn't just the people. And it isn't just the leaders. Israel is revealing as a whole people what lies beneath the appearance that they are following God. The people of Israel lack trust in their God. This is the evaluation that's made, what these passages come to express. They do not trust the God that they've spent the last year with in such a way that they are able to actually follow him. Even if the Israelites have been diligent to do what he's commanded up to this point, obedience in the face of danger, when the threat of your life is at stake, this is a different matter, right? I will follow you wherever you go, even to death. Peter tells Jesus from the comfort of the upper room where they enjoyed their Passover dinner. But then he had his sword taken away and found himself incredibly vulnerable and revealed his lack of trust. Let's look at a bit more at a few of these events, the first 3 really of the 6, just as a way of sort of wrestling with what is this? How does this lack of trust manifest itself? How does this look? In the first of the 6 episodes of the story, Moses speaks with his in-laws. And there's nothing wrong with in-laws, I promise you. My in-laws are here this morning. And he makes this request in chapter 10, verse 31. He says this to one of his in-laws, "Please do not leave us, for you know where we should camp in the wilderness, and you will serve as eyes for us." Now, to be honest, there are some who in commentaries have said they do not think that Moses is doing anything wrong here. And so I have to acknowledge that there are some who don't see this as a bad thing. But it seems to me that read in the context of the unfolding story, it makes the most sense in light of what we read earlier, that Moses is now hedging his bets in some way, right? Because God has promised to be their guide through the wilderness. In fact, God has even given them an additional, we didn't read this, but an additional sort of signal that they were to, how they would know to follow. There would be trumpet blasts. So between God's actual presence moving and the trumpet blast, this was supposed to be signal enough. But Moses needs something else, it appears. He wants to make sure that he has a human, someone alongside of him who can confirm God's wisdom. God is moving this way. Yeah, that looks like a good way to go, right? This kind of thing is what seems to be going on here. And this is actually a common theme in Scripture. God tells the Israelites, I will fight for you. And the Israelites say, cool, God, but don't mind this army and these horses and these chariots that I'm stockpiling. Just in case you don't come through, these are kind of our backup plan. This is Israel's story as it goes along. And for us, God has told us how to follow him. He has told us how we are to know him and to know his will. It is through his word and by his Spirit. And yet this myth continues to pervade in American Christianity that I don't need to read the Bible to know God. To know God for myself, that's not important. I can live on a diet of devotionals and sermons and memory verses. And yet, God has made it clear that the Scriptures are the way by which we seek him and know him and understand his heart and discover how we might follow him. As we move on, don't blink or you'll miss the next story, because it's just 3 verses. In chapter 11, verse 1, we read, the people complained in the hearing of the Lord about their misfortunes, and God responds with some fiery discipline. A couple weeks ago, I was at a park. Rebecca was riding her bike, and I was running, and we just stopped. She wanted to play, and I overheard a couple ladies complaining about their church's misfortunes. And I thought, hey, I've heard those complaints before. When I started on staff at a church in Kansas City, I remember hearing several people complain. And I remember thinking, hey, I've heard these complaints before. And it was funny, it was kind of an aha for me, because the church that I was at in Kansas City had 300 more people, and yet the complaints were identical. Changed the names, and they were exactly the same. Paul, in 1 Corinthians 10, cites these exact passages when he says that we are not to grumble or complain as the Israelites did in the wilderness. Our lives might have the appearance of following Jesus. But if we are complainers and grumblers, our words and our complaints condemn us as people who do not trust God to do what he has said he is going to do. The third story is a little bit longer than 3 verses. And it has 3 different acts, but we're just going to look at the first one this morning. Acts of not trusting. In chapter 11, verse 4, we read, now the rabble that was among them had a strong craving, or in Hebrew it's they craved a great craving. The emphasis there is, this is a huge craving. And the people of Israel also wept again and said, oh, that we had meat to eat. Now we've already encountered complaining, but that complaining was situated in misfortune. It was the sort of, woe is me, woe is us, everything is terrible kind of complaining. But this complaining is different. This complaining looks at what God gives the Israelites every single day. An abundance of special and miraculous bread that they can't explain, to the extent that they just name the stuff, what's it? And they cry, your provision is not enough. They are unsatisfied. They are discontent with God's gifts and grace, and they want more. Paul tells us in Ephesians 1, that God has given us every spiritual blessing in the heavenly realms. We certainly cannot cry that God has not given us what we need. We have been given God's Son, God's Word, God's Spirit, and God's church. We have been given every blessing in the heavenly realms, as Paul says. Everything that we need for a life of following God has been made available to us. I mean, do you believe that? Can we be content with these gifts that God has given to us so graciously? Or do we require meat? Do we demand meat? Do we cry for meat? And I think it's an interesting question. What forms the meat that we cry out for takes in the church? I was talking to a friend of mine recently who goes to another church, and he's asking me how things were going at the church. And so I started to tell him about all of the ways that people have been sharing with me how they have been growing in their faith, how they've been growing in their families, growing together in their families, and kind of some of the things that have been happening in some of our small groups. And practically ignoring everything I just said, he asked me, jumped right in, yeah, but what are you guys doing for youth? And so I told him, I said, oh, well, we're working to train parents to disciple their own children. And we've got ministries that our teenagers can serve in. And we've got adults in our church who pray for and who connect with some of the teenagers that we're like loosely connected to in various degrees. And we tell teenagers that they are a part of our church. And so they belong and worship for us. And so we're doing everything for them. My friend said, wow, there would be a rebellion in our church if we didn't have a youth group. And so in the spirit of numbers, I responded, and we ended up having a really good conversation about it. I said, and they would reveal what lies beneath the surface of the appearance that they are following God. They have the appearance of wanting to follow God, but they are discontent with the resources that God has given them. They want meat, they don't want daily bread. God has given them His Son, His Word, His Spirit, and His church, and every spiritual blessing in the heavenly realms. And yet somewhere they got the idea that youth must have youth group in order to follow God and to grow up into maturity. They don't believe that God's gifts of Jesus, His Word, His Spirit, and the church are enough to nurture faith in teenagers. And so they demonstrate their trust in programs and fun, and they think that God really is so boring that teenagers couldn't possibly be interested in Him unless we play games. God promised to provide Israel daily bread. He didn't promise them meat, but they grew tired of God's gifts. And they demonstrated that beneath the appearance of following God, they do not trust Him. And they are not interested in the promises that He has given to them. These are 3 of the 6 episodes, events. But based on how I've engaged these 3, we very well could continue this conversation and could evaluate the following 3. And begin to identify some of the ways in which we also manifest the lack of trust expressed in these stories. Actually, this passage is part of what our small group is going to be dealing with tonight. So here's my shameless plug for small group. Steve and Connie's 5 p.m. We eat dinner after our study, and if you want to talk about these extra 3, we'll be there. Commercial over. I named this sermon "Herding Cats" for a reason. I know I haven't mentioned cats at all throughout this entire sermon because I don't want to be too harsh to cats, because we have some cat lovers in our midst who I won't name. Dave and Whitney. It's okay, we forgive you. In high school.
We're the only ones with cats.
Probably. In high school, we had a cat for a bit. And that cat did nothing but sleep all day. I won't lie. A sleeping cat isn't the worst thing in the world. In fact, there's a certain, though limited, cute quality to it. Just saying. But here's the thing about every cat that I have ever known. The sun goes down, and that cat reveals its true nature. The cat we had would shriek and would cling to things, ripping up furniture with his claws, tearing up the carpet. It would race around. It was like one of those terrible things I'd ever seen when I was in high school. What in the world is happening? So this, on top of what happened to me as a younger child, one of my best friends had a cat, and I would sleep over at his house all the time. And every time I would sleep over there, if I slept on the couch, it would sit on the armrest right above my head, and it would just claw at my hair, like trying to literally pull it from my scalp. I never slept at his house again. The time I woke up and saw the cat flying through the air, claws out at me, I was done. Cats are the worst. But on the appearance, they don't look so bad. The Israelites' journey through the wilderness is like a herd of cats in the middle of the night. Here in Numbers, we're presented with what many consider to be a central New Testament theme. The law is not sufficient. The appearance of obedience and faithfulness is not the same thing as a dynamic trust in God lived out in relationship with God through Jesus. And as we discover in these stories, the First Testament is yelling as loudly as the New Testament on this point, that we are called to trust God and walk with him in relationship, the very same way the Israelites were called to trust God and walk with him in relationship. And we're called to trust his promises, and that should actually be manifest and demonstrated in certain faithful ways. That we are called to trust him by refusing to look to our idols as our backup plans. That we are called to trust him by refusing to complain in hardship. That we are to trust him by being grateful for the abundance of gifts that he has given us. Trust God. And don't rely on the appearance of trust, but actually trust is the call that this passage offers to us this morning. And that as we come to the table, reminded of the extent to which God would go to demonstrate his love and his faithfulness for us. Allow this to be an expression, a way of responding and say, I will respond in trust. I will live in such a way that I am near to you, God, and will listen to you and seek you and serve you in your kingdom.